Sir, we've detected multiple signs that StarCraft III is in development.
Hell, it's about time.
Okay, so this one's a bit of a stretch, but it's possible, particularly given Activision's fondness of monetizing Blizzard's old franchises to make a quick buck. If this were true, it would put Blizzard in direct competition with Frost Giant Studios. Frost Giant is made up of many former Blizzard employees, and they set out on a mission to create the next generation RTS game. And we know this one's in development because we've seen the announcement trailer and the pre-alpha gameplay footage. I wanted to try and predict whether either of these games had the potential to be a classic, like some of Blizzard's old RTS games such as StarCraft Brood War and Warcraft 3. To do this, I looked at the personnel involved in those legendary franchises, in addition to StarCraft II, and I tracked where they've gone with their careers. I looked at music, art, cinematics, game design, game production, programming, and studio structure. Often the first thing you see of modern games is a cinematic announcement trailer. This was not always the norm, and in fact, Blizzard, with the launch of StarCraft, was one of the industry pioneers in this regard. They created the cinematics team within the company, tasked with creating legendary cinematics through the years. It's no exaggeration to say that Blizzard and Square Enix have been head and shoulders above the competition when it comes to cinematics for decades. Despite the recent talent drain at Blizzard, the cinematics team is still headed up by its original founder, Jeff Chamberlain, who's been with the company for 25 years, and Diablo 4 was a clear indication that their team is still number one, just staggering, absolutely fantastic. For the announcement of Stormgate, Frost Giant also released a cinematic, and obviously it's not up to the standards of Blizzard, but it did a good job in introducing the game and sparking some interest. If you consider the fact that Blizzard's VFX team has over 200 people working in it, and Frost Giant's LinkedIn profile lists 55 employees in total, I think you can see why comparisons are slightly unfair at this stage. I was really impressed by the story of StarCraft, Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2, and thoroughly enjoyed completing the single-player campaigns for all of those games. This is in no small part down to the influence of Blizzard legend Chris Metzen, responsible for story, scripting, artwork, even contributing sound effects to some StarCraft units. Chris has had a massive influence in creating the universes of Blizzard's most loved franchises. I'm sure Chris's return has been a massive boost to Blizzard during a difficult time. For now he's just working as creative director on Warcraft, but I can imagine him branching out in future. Longtime Blizzard writer and now freelancer, Mickey Nielsen has teamed up with Frost Giant for Stormgate, so I think both of these games are in a really strong position in terms of story, although obviously Blizzard have the history and the IP to build upon, whereas Stormgate will have to strike out and forge something new. Next I took a look at artwork and music. Blizzard has always had a very distinctive visual style, which has appealed to both Eastern and Western audiences, and that's in large part due to the influence of Samwise Didier, long-term art director at Blizzard. The reason orcs look the way they do, or the Zerg, or the Protoss, or anything you can think of in these universes, is down to the influence of Sam and also Chris Metzen. In addition to basically every single other Blizzard game, Sam was an art director on StarCraft, Brood War, Warcraft 3, and StarCraft II, so he's had a huge influence on each game's visual style. Some say the Blizzard artwork style is somewhat of an acquired taste, but I think I can say that in large part it's been very successful and people just love the way these characters, these units, these universes look. Sam is still with Blizzard as a senior art director, so expect him to be involved in any future projects. With this in mind, any potential StarCraft III project is starting from a very strong position in terms of artwork and visual design. While Blizzard obviously have the edge here, Frost Giant Studios can count on the support of Jesse Brophy, who was lead artist on StarCraft II and is now working on the Stormgate project. While I don't necessarily think that music and audio design are hugely important in RTS games, it is still worth a mention. While Brood War obviously had some very catchy theme tunes such as the Terran themes, I think Warcraft 3 and subsequently StarCraft 2 were much more complete in terms of the full soundtrack and the audio design. I particularly think that StarCraft 2 was just fantastic start to finish in terms of the soundtrack for all the races, all of the audio effects for all the units, the campaign cutscenes, the voice acting. It was all just top notch and really high quality. With this in mind, I'm pleased to see Blizzard veterans Glenn Stafford and Derek Duke, who worked on all of those titles, are still with the company and presumably will be contributing to any StarCraft III development. With this in mind, I think Blizzard are obviously starting from an advantageous position relative to Stormgate here. Now we're getting to the nuts and bolts of things, the actual gameplay mechanics and the systems within the game. This is where I start to worry for a potential StarCraft III and its gameplay. First of all, I looked at producers, which I think is essentially like a director on a film. It's the person who carries the can, is ultimately responsible for the finished product. They have sort of creative control, so to speak. There are two key people here. First of all, there's Chris Sagatti, who was producer on Warcraft 3 and subsequently StarCraft 2. And then there is Shane DeBeery, who was the StarCraft Brood War producer. Now, interestingly, both these individuals have left Blizzard, and they've both gone to a studio called Dreamhaven, which was formed by former Blizzard CEO Mike Morhaime. Now, keep this in mind because I'll be coming back to Dreamhaven and one of its underlying studios called Moonshot Games a little bit later. What we can say at this stage is that any potential producer for a StarCraft 3 title would be an unknown quantity. It would not be somebody who's been responsible for delivering any of the previous storied Blizzard RTS franchise games. On the Stormgate side of things, we have Tim Morton in place as product director for the title. He's an industry veteran, having worked most recently on StarCraft 2, but previously he was at Westwood/EA working on Command & Conquer titles, and he also worked on MechWarrior 2, which by the way is an absolute banger of a game. Up next we have designers, who are responsible for the gameplay mechanics, the rules and systems within each game, so obviously very important to the way it plays. Rob Pardo was designer for Brood War and Warcraft 3, and former Blizzard CEO as well. 2016 he moved on to make his own studio called Bonfire Studios. I'm yet to hear about what they're working on. The designer for StarCraft 2 was Dustin Browder, and for many he was the face of StarCraft 2, seeing him in the battle reports and various interviews and features. Some of you may remember Dustin's catchphrase from the battle reports, where he talks about terrible, terrible damage, which became a bit of a meme and was ultimately immortalized in the game.
Oh, terrible, terrible damage on both sides.
Ship has taken terrible, terrible damage.
Like several names that I mentioned previously, Dustin has also moved on to Moonshot, which is a studio within Dreamhaven. There's no news yet as to whether they're working on any kind of RTS game. I do find it quite interesting that so many of the people involved in these previous RTS games have congregated at Dreamhaven. On the Stormgate side of things, we have Tim Campbell as the game director. He previously worked on Command & Conquer Red Alert before moving to Blizzard, where he worked on Warcraft 3 and was involved in the early days of StarCraft 2 as a lead campaign designer. So as far as gameplay and design is concerned, I don't really have any reason to think that Blizzard would be able to recreate the magic of Brood War or Warcraft 3. Indeed, the people that were there at the time have moved on, and StarCraft 2 definitely had a few issues in that regard. In terms of programming or software engineering, it's probably worth mentioning that Bob Fitch, who was lead programmer for StarCraft, is still with Blizzard 32 years later, and he's basically been involved in every single project they've shipped. At Frostgiant Studios, James Anhalt is the lead engineer. Previously, he was the lead pathfinding engineer for StarCraft 2, and he was at Blizzard for a very long time, even helping to create the original Battle.net. In terms of competitive play or eSports, StarCraft Brood War and Warcraft 3 were absolute heavyweights, still played to this day, still often the centerpiece of many tournaments. There was plenty of excitement, support and goodwill towards StarCraft 2 as it launched, hoping it would become the replacement for Brood War to be the next big RTS esport game for the future. And results were mixed. I think there are several reasons why StarCraft 2 stuttered as an esport, and one of the big ones was obviously mismanagement of the whole Korean esports scene, the professional team houses, the KESPA organization, and the fact that we essentially had StarCraft Brood War and StarCraft 2 running in parallel and competing with each other, and the take-up of StarCraft 2 in South Korea was kind of weak as a result of this clash between the two titles. Now obviously StarCraft 2 looks and sounds a million times better than Brood War, but the gameplay does not crush Brood War. If anything, the gameplay in Brood War is just more refined, more balanced, and there were some glaring issues with StarCraft II. Obviously, balance is debatable, but some things that are not debatable are the fact that infinite control groups and unit clumping and stacking on top of each other led to giant death balls and battles that resolved in a matter of 5 seconds. There was very little sort of back and forth, to and fro. There was usually one giant supply capped army against another giant supply capped army, and whichever one won decisively, the game was over. I think another potential barrier in terms of competing with contemporary games was the fact that StarCraft II was obviously AAA title with a AAA price tag. You're paying for the single player campaign, but you had to buy that to play the multiplayer as well. And you're talking about other games such as League of Legends at the time, where it's free to play. And I think the accessibility issue maybe made StarCraft less popular than it otherwise could have been. That's not to say that StarCraft II was a complete flop in terms of competitive esports. And indeed, there were some great moments, some great tournaments, and I still watch the GSL finals to this day. But there are definitely feelings of what could have been and an opportunity lost. In the early days of StarCraft II, Blizzard heavily supported independent tournaments such as the GSL and in Europe, ESL, Extreme Masters, and they also hosted their own tournament every year at BlizzCon. And then they extended that into the World Championship Series, where they had like a regional competition, which then culminated in the grand finals at each annual BlizzCon tournament. Well, fast forward to today, and they've basically pulled all funding from StarCraft II esports. All the independent organizations that organize tournaments are on their own. If they want to organize StarCraft as part of their tournament, Blizzard are not helping, basically, at least financially. And we've not seen a StarCraft tournament at BlizzCon since 2019. So there's nothing to tell me that Blizzard would be at all willing to really give heavy financial backing to a StarCraft III esports scene, for example. When I look to Stormgate, I'm really encouraged in this regard. Not necessarily by sort of financial clout, but just by who they have involved, the steps they're taking, the decisions they're making. Everything is really positive so far. There's a clear roadmap for the production of this game and how it's going to be the next great esports RTS. And one of the first key decisions that they've made is the game will be free to play. So, like I was saying previously, they've made it clear in their intentions that they want to make this the most accessible RTS they possibly can. So, trying to have the best of both worlds. Having a low barrier to entry, also in terms of skill, but then not having a low skill ceiling. So, easy to get into, hard to master, inclusive game, looking for a large audience basically, and really trying to interact with the community. In terms of specifics, obviously it's early days, but Frost Giant have announced that they plan to run a seasonal circuit, also try and promote grassroots esports, so they'll be supporting independent tournaments and the like. And they also plan to bring their seasonal circuit together with an annual World Championship event. So it sounds similar to the heydays of StarCraft II, where you had GSL, ESL being independent, whilst you also had the WCS Blizzard series taking place. When I look to the personnel involved, I'm also very encouraged. First up, you see Monk from the Battle Report, aka Kevin Dong. He was lead co-op designer on StarCraft II. And prior to that, as a long-time StarCraft fan, he was a writer for Team Liquid. That's obviously a great start. And then, just a small aside perhaps, you have Cara LaForge, who's a business operations director at Frost Giant. And she formerly worked at Blizzard for a long time as a senior program manager. And she is mother to Day9 and Tasteless, who anybody familiar with StarCraft or StarCraft II will know. Maybe just a small detail, but I think it was really nice to see some of the early access footage and the show match from Stormgate featuring TLO, who is a household name to StarCraft or RTS fans. Even Total Annihilation players will remember him. And you have people like Harstem involved. You have Day9 involved in the release statement coverage by IGN. It all just seems like similar vibes to StarCraft II. Like the community's behind it. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of goodwill, and they seem to be making all the right decisions so far. I do think esports is still an area where some passion is required. Not necessarily the most financially lucrative thing to be pursuing with a game. And I definitely don't think that if there was a StarCraft 3 that Blizzard would make any effort to make it the best esport game they possibly could, or to grow the scene, or to fund tournaments or anything like that, because everything they've done in the past couple of years has just been slap in the face in that regard. From defunding StarCraft 2 to mismanagement of World of Warcraft arena tournaments and the like, to the terrible release of Warcraft 3 Reforged, it's just not giving a good indication. Finally, I looked at the business model and the sort of studio environment that these games would be developed in. And this is really where I think Activision, Microsoft, Blizzard, whatever, are just not going to have any chance of creating a good game. So Activision, Blizzard, with a current acquisition from Microsoft still pending, barring any sort of antitrust blockages, it looks like it will go through. They're a publicly listed company who have quarterly earnings reports, and their senior management, the board, the CEO, etc., are incentivized based on the performance of the share price. A large portion of executive compensation is delivered in the form of stock options, so shares in the company. So they have a direct vested interest in pumping the share price as high as they can, and also hitting certain milestones on a quarterly or annual basis in terms of earnings or various financial metrics. What this leads to is cost-cutting exercises and essentially bullshit at the end of quarters or certain milestones. For example, putting games on sale a few weeks before the end of a financial reporting period so they can report increased sales for the quarter because they got a spike at the end, or putting all the Diablo 4 developers into crunch mode and rushing out the game to be released on the 6th of the 6th, 666, because obviously that's more important than actually quality assurance and making sure the game is ready. In acquiring Blizzard, what Activision were essentially trying to acquire was the lucrative World of Warcraft subscriber base and the income that generates. Also the talent, although there's been a massive brain drain from Blizzard given recent scandals and the like. And perhaps most importantly, their back catalogue of intellectual property, their legendary franchises such as Warcraft, StarCraft, Diablo. Now that they've paid a lot of money to acquire Blizzard, they have to monetize these assets, which means they have to do everything in their power to cut costs. So in one of the most successful years they ever had, they let go of 800 employees because, why not? Yeah? And they've shown a huge appetite to try and monetize previous franchises as cheaply as possible, and quality has not really been a concern. So we've seen really shoddy remastered versions of old classics. Warcraft 3 Reforged was just a disaster, an absolute disaster. 0 out of 10 on Metacritic, deservedly so. The only bright spot was Diablo 2 Resurrected. That was well done with some smart quality of life changes. Essentially what they're trying to do is milk the nostalgia, milk the goodwill towards these franchises with as little financial investment as possible. I think Diablo 4 is a perfect encapsulation of what Activision Blizzard are all about nowadays. Essentially, they want to create a 3-star game, 70% out of 100. Passable. It looks nice. It doesn't run very well. It's been rushed. It's buggy. And it's full of lots of mechanics that are just not player friendly in terms of monetization. There's pay to win. There's pay to access the game a week early. There's just sort of psychological tricks in terms of making the cash option the default thing you click on when you open the menu. Or in Diablo Immortal, their business model was actually targeting what's known as whales. They were looking for people who would spend tens of thousands of dollars on the game to unlock pay-to-win cosmetics, whatever it may be. And it was the most predatory mechanic where you could open an unlimited number of these gems, whatever it was, and you could never get all the gems you wanted. It was just gambling. It was down to chance. If you think back to the heydays of an independent Blizzard, you would think of the phrase, "It's done when it's done." We'll release the game when it meets our quality standards. And indeed, there are some projects that never got released because they didn't meet the quality standards. So StarCraft Ghost or there was the Titan project, which eventually got retooled, let's not say reforged, into Overwatch. So they had standards, and they spent as long as they needed to make the game a game worthy of a Blizzard title. I think that was definitely a golden age in game development, and I'm not quite sure that we can expect that of any modern studio, regardless of the structure. But cross-chat studios, they do stand a better chance of pushing the quality and releasing a game when it's ready, and actually thinking about the right things, thinking about the player. Because you make a good game and it'll be financially successful. You don't have to stuff it with pay to win. You don't have to stuff it with bullshit skins or predatory mechanics. If you just make the best game possible, there'll be an audience for it. So Frostchat Studios are an independent studio. They're not publicly listed, so they don't have shareholders who they're beholden to, but they do have financial backing from outsiders in order to fund their projects. So you've got venture capital firms. I think you've got some funding from some other game studios, and I would say there's going to be a bit more patience from those kind of people than, say, the shareholders of Activision Blizzard and the greedy CEOs of Activision Blizzard. But there are still financial realities. They will have to put out a game in a reasonable time frame, and they will have to make a game that is economically viable. You know, this is not Star Citizen over here. So I think in summary, I would say if any StarCraft III was to materialize, my prediction is it will look nice, it will sound nice, it will play okay, but it will be somewhat soulless, and it will be full of sort of predatory mechanics to try and gouge as much money out of the player base as possible. And eSports will just be an afterthought. There'll be no financial investment in that regard. It'll be what Blizzard Activision goes for nowadays. Mediocrity that sells because of nostalgia. My prediction for Stormgate is I do hope it'll be a passion project, and I think it will launch and it'll be good, it'll be played. And if you think back to the early days of a game like League of Legends, it was very rough around the edges. I think Stormgate will be patched and patched and patched, and it will gradually grow. I don't think it'll be an instant smash hit that takes over the scene and has, like, you know, the world's biggest tournaments and everything like that straight away. But I think it will be a slow burner, and I think it will gradually grow into a game that we love, and I hope will stand the test of time. It's also worth mentioning that on the 7th of August, Stormgate is entering the alpha phase, and they'll be granting access to more people who have opted in for the beta to playtest at this stage. So if you're interested, then there's still time for you to opt in, and you may be one of the lucky few that gets picked. If you've made it all the way to the end of the video, then I just want to thank you, and I hope you enjoyed some of it, learned something maybe. And a question for you. Does an RTS have to be a smash hit esport to be a success? Or should we be looking for maybe a hark back to more story-driven RTS games? You know, a Command & Conquer or the Warcraft 3 single-player campaign. Is that what we should be looking for? Is esports too high of a bar to reach in terms of balance and game design? Let me know what you think in the comments below.